Okay, good afternoon. I am Chiang from the Institute for Adult Learning in Singapore. So what we do is to study how these ideas of skills can sustain through adult life, how to make learning, improve our quality of learning for adults. So this presentation, I'll look at the cross-country analysis of the drivers and returns of skills and skills accumulation using the variety of capitalism framework. So we'll investigate skills accumulation across the life course. So actually this builds on one of the earlier work that I've done on a Singapore focus, but what we have done using the PIAAC data is to extend it to an international comparative perspective. And of course, we know one of the most unique contribution of PIAAC is that measurement of skills proficiency, which it's an angle that we couldn't do previously, although what we had was longitudinal data. So I think this is what is interesting. So in this earlier Singapore study, what we did was to look at this idea of cumulative advantage, how initial education actually sets a lot of the trajectory and life opportunities, both for skills development as well as the returns to skills in Singapore context. But what we also found was that in terms of there were elements that could mitigate this cost. For example, the way that jobs are designed, whether employers provide the opportunities for skills to be used and for skills to be built through that process as well. So with that international perspective that we have over here, I think it's even more valuable because we can bring in what other countries can do to actually then understand how this shapes skills development and returns across the life course for us to actually then take lessons on from Singapore. Okay, so this is the general gist of what we actually aim to do. So I would say that although this is a comparative analysis framework, because the perspective of what I have is I'm familiar with the Singapore system, but then if there are other perspectives, I think it's a welcome discussion for me to actually learn and improve on how to interpret some of the findings that we actually see. So what we do is to take the varieties of capitalism perspectives from Hall and Soskis. So what we look at is the liberal market economies, LME, so the countries selected, we have the US and the UK, the coordinated market economies, Finland and Switzerland, and of course then the Singapore will be a state-led manpower and skills development model that is aligned with economic priorities. So we are focused on some of these countries. I think the selection of countries is also available, decided based on data availability, because some of these countries have a fuller set of data available for us to analyze. Okay. And we look at how institutions shape skills accumulation pathways. So in terms of pathways, what we look at is, of course, there's the initial education credentials, but then there's also participation in structured training, as well as, I think what I personally am very interested in is this idea of job task design, how to facilitate the skills building through work processes, learning at work, as well as performance of tasks at work. So it's like the use it and lose it perspective. So of course then what we are using is PIAAC Cycle 2 data. Of course there's possibility of extending it for a comparison with Cycle 1 data. We did some of that for Singapore, but anyway, for this presentation I'll keep it just to Cycle 2 data. It provides us with a direct comparable measures of skills proficiency to allow analysis of how the skills are developed and valued across national contexts. So of the mentioned, the 5 countries that we will present for this analysis, as well as the sample analyzed, will focus on the employees aged 25 to 65, not currently in further education, because this is part of what we want to do to study in-work dynamics. This is part of what I'm familiar with, like to study this idea of skills at work. So the approach would be to do, what we first did was to do a cross-country comparison, descriptives basically of how some of these skills proficiency, education training, and job task design are distributed across education levels in the countries. And then a regression-based decompositions of the drivers of skills proficiency. And for wages, because we only have the micro data for Singapore, so we'll focus on that. We analyze the training and the impacts of job task effects on skills, so how participation in training as well as distribution of job tasks impact skills, and finally to understand the relative contributions of credentials versus skills to outcomes. So to set the context, what we actually saw when we analyzed the top line findings for Singapore was that there's actually large proficiency gaps in Singapore, and this is we actually have a very, I think one of the largest proportion of tertiary educated so this is the short cycle tertiary as well as the degree educated population in Singapore. It's actually, I think, one of the largest amongst all the countries that participated in Cycle 2. But what we saw was a very large differential between the tertiary and non-tertiary educated. I think we were flagged out for being one of the highest differential. But then when we see there are other models out there, and I think what caught our eye was Finland, which is a CME, that actually had a high, so they actually generally have high proficiency scores, but I think what's more striking is that it's compact, so the difference between the tertiary and non-tertiary educated is not so stark. I mean, UK also has that compact model, but I think the highest of it is not attained. So anyway, okay, another thing is for this presentation, I'll focus mostly on numeracy proficiency skills. I think because when we run the patterns for literacy, it's more or less aligned, so we'll just focus on numeracy here and we'll take the details elsewhere for literacy. Okay. Then I think another way to put that into perspective is then we look at the distribution of qualifications versus skills in the population. And what caught our eye was at Singapore, clearly that's a higher proportion of tertiary educated with low skills proficiency and a smaller proportion of non-tertiary educated with mid-high skills. But when we look at the Finland and Switzerland models, the patterns are switched. So they actually have a higher proportion of non-tertiary mid-high skills versus tertiary low skills. So this actually suggests that there's value in creating that skills versus the early education. So it's a switch from Singapore where everything is where it's the credentials heavily drive what kind of skills people have. So this is something that when we look at skills accumulation throughout life, then this is I think positive that we see Finland and Switzerland having the ability to then contribute to skills despite not having that initial credentials. So it's the cumulative advantage perspective. So then what we then do is, based on some of that findings, is to then perform a regression-based decomposition analysis of the drivers of skills proficiency in these 5 countries. And what actually struck our eye was in Singapore, credentials actually form a large proportion of what explains numeracy proficiency. So basically when they have higher education level, that basically explains a very high proportion of what contributes to skills. Then in the CMEs, what we actually then see is a lot of it comes from the performance of job tasks, as well as, I think, importantly, work experience as well, because the other one that probably we can't really measure is work experience and job tenure that they take to perform that job. That also signals that might be how they actually build skills outside of everyday, outside of credentials. And then I think in the US, what we then saw was also a large contribution of the socio-economic factor. So this, I think we put it under the individual characteristics. We looked at things like a parental education as well as number of books read at 14 years old. And that proportion is actually extremely high, higher on average in the US than some of the other countries. So I think that explains some of the differences that we see. When we then compare, this is numeracy proficiency, I think when we look at literacy proficiency, what happens is a little bit more of it is explained by things like native language and immigration, but otherwise the general patterns of the components of what contributes, for example, credentials versus in-work experiences, I think generally the patterns are similar, so we just present the numeracy findings here today. Okay. So then now we look at how training, so we look at training. I think the other thing that we caught our eye was that in Singapore, structured training participation actually didn't really contribute to numeracy proficiency score, so we wanted to find out why. So we then deep dive into training participation, and we found that, I think on average, we had a discussion this morning, it could be that the way that PIAAC measures structured training participation, there's actually a fall from cycle 1 to cycle 2 in Singapore, but actually not for the rest of the countries. But anyway, in Singapore, although it's lower, but I think what also is quite important is that the difference between participation for the tertiary and non-tertiary educated groups is especially stark compared to some of the other countries that we see. In particular, what we saw was it's higher in the US, and the training participation is higher in the US and the Finland, with Finland showing actually a more compact structure. So the difference between education levels in terms of training participation is not so high. Then we look at the contribution of training participation to numeracy proficiency gain scores. And in Singapore, there's no effect amongst the training participants and non-participants. And this is even after we then control for education level. So it's like close to 0. There's no difference between whether they participate or not. But in the other countries that we analyze in general, there's actually, amongst the training participants, is actually higher proficiency score. So, I mean, of course, this is a cross-sectional result, so we could be that it's not a causality, but also that the access to training could be that the higher skilled are more likely to be able to access training as well. So that is something that we need to further investigate. But even then, that also suggests that training access there's no differential in Singapore, but at least in the other countries, when it comes to the non-tertiary educated population, especially when it comes to job-related training, they do tend to benefit from it. Okay, and then the next one will be the job task patterns. So I think the main finding that we want to say from here is that in terms of performance of job task levels, when we look at tertiary versus non-tertiary, the difference in Singapore, like what's considered high skill use and low skill use, is actually very stuck in Singapore versus some of the rest of the countries. And in particular, I think the LMEs have high cognitive and complex task component, but when it comes to the CME, it comes with a more participatory model where discretion is much higher. So we suspect that that might be some of the reasons why the differences. Okay, then I think this is the interesting one. So when we look at Singapore, for some reason, those who perform higher task requirement jobs have actually lower skills proficiency, but the ability for the CMEs to then contribute, especially for the non-tertiary educated population through the performance of work tasks, it's much higher. So there's a positive relationship between high job task performance and skills proficiency, especially for the non-tertiary educated groups, which is consistent with some of the ideas of use it and lose it. So it suggests that then it's that work environment that gives that that ability to build skills throughout life that is not in Singapore. Of course, then this comes with the idea of then I mean, this is a composite score of high task requirements, but then what we want is we can actually break it down into how different types of job tasks contributes to proficiency. Okay, I'll skip this. And then when it comes to the wage returns, we actually then see the same patterns of it being highly driven by the qualifications rather than the skill requirements in Singapore. So I think that's something that's consistent with what we understand of opportunities and skills in Singapore. Okay, so when it comes to why this is important, is also when we do a macro perspective and we see the correlation. It's a weak correlation between numeracy proficiency scores and GDP versus a stronger correlation between numeracy proficiency scores and inclusive development. So that's why we also think that it's important that we drive a more inclusive development through skills. This is a way of understanding why this idea of cumulative advantage and mitigating it is quite important. So this is a summary of the findings. So in the US and the UK, we see large proficiency gaps across education levels, especially in the UK, where training contributes to skills gains, but opportunities are uneven across education groups. High cognitive and complex job demands, but they don't actually translate to higher skills. But so we actually think that what it means is that the opportunities are shaped mainly by market forces and individual resources, so it's the LME model. In the Finland and Switzerland model, they have a high and compact skill distribution, strong training participation, especially in Finland. And because of the participatory job design with high discretion, it's able to support skills development beyond credentials, and institutional support helps to mitigate cumulative advantage and create more inclusive lifelong learning opportunities. And for Singapore, I think what we actually then, when I was looking at it, I thought it was like really about the credential signaling through that strongly influences lifelong skills accumulation and opportunities. So it's because it's coordinated, it's state-led, so that credential itself actually means a lot. So building on that, what we can do further is to explore the distribution of job tasks. So we took it as a composite measure here, but I think it's the distribution as well in terms of maybe what's a generative versus innovative-oriented kind of work task and job task skills used versus a more routine and efficiency-driven. So it's the idea of routine cognitive versus repetition as well in terms of what drives, how the job tasks are designed at work. Also maybe to think about it from a macro level analysis, so we can look at some macro level indicators to build on this. And the third one will be the life course analysis, either through a pseudo cohort or longitudinal data to track the career trajectories and mobility patterns. So in conclusion, institutional arrangements can shape skills accumulation, moving from a cumulative advantage to an alternative trajectory framework. And organizational and job design matter. So participatory models with high discretion, such as in CMEs, look to be better able to turn task performance into learning opportunities to extend skills development beyond formal education. And training contributes but unevenly, so it's about how we can have a more evenly distributed training and equitable access with work. Okay, thank you.